So first of all, I'd like to say I'm really pleased to be talking here at the Contemporary. I did my MA in art history at the University of Nottingham. When I finished, I applied for a job here as a gallery assistant, and I remember distinctly in the interview two questions that kind of stood out. One was, how would I use my knowledge of art history to discuss with visitors the art that was in the gallery? So I wanted to kind of explore that a bit more. And the other question was, would I be prepared to help clear up if a child vomited in the gallery space? Unfortunately, I didn't get the job, but I'm really pleased to be back here talking about both art history and vomit today. My paper's called The Politics of Cultural Critique, Vomit and Disgust in Paul McCarthy's Performances in the 1970s. So I'll just jump straight in. In the 1970s, Los Angeles-based artist Paul McCarthy made visceral performances which appealed to audiences' innermost feelings of disgust and revulsion. Using everyday materials such as hot dogs, ground meat, ketchup, mustard and mayonnaise, he enacted performances of consumerism in which he both ingested and expelled this potent mixture of foodstuffs. Smearing these materials over his naked body, moulding them and attaching them to himself as masks, muzzles and extra limbs, stuffing them into his mouth to the point of choking, and attempting and often failing to consume and digest them, McCarthy's performances leave a lasting effect on audiences. He succeeds in relaying a sense of nausea to his audience, both in the live moment of performance and through documentation. In this paper, I consider vomiting in McCarthy's performances and the sense of nausea felt by his audience as an act of resistance against unthinking consumers who swallow culture whole. Focusing on two performances, Hot Dog from 1974 and Tubbing from 1975, I look at the urge to vomit and the will to prevent it as a way of both alienating audiences and becoming more intimate with them. Artist Barbara T. Smith recalls her experience of watching the live performance Hot Dog and the nausea she felt when McCarthy stuffs numerous hot dogs into his mouth. She considered it kinder to leave the room to vomit than to do so in front of the artist, for fear that he would do the same and risk choking. In my own reflections on the video performance Tubbing, I read McCarthy's struggle to chew and digest raw meat not only as a struggle with his own body, but as indicative of his career-long interest in the politics of cultural critique, breaking it up, destroying it, and reconfiguring it into something less palatable. For these pieces in particular, I argue that McCarthy's politics involve not just a critique of consumerism, but also asks questions of intersubjectivity and evokes a politics of communion and care. The distinction between live and recorded works is important to the argument I'm presenting because I want to look at the way McCarthy presents potentially disgusting displays of consumerism, i.e. physically ingesting material which is then expelled, to an audience of would-be consumers. My contention is not that audiences viewing the performance through documentation are less affected by the work. Rather, through live events and documentation, McCarthy proposes that the feeling of disgust, manifesting itself in the act of vomiting or the urge to vomit, offers the possibility of creating a relationship with his audience which is both intimate and alienating. The paper is in part a reflection on my own practice of studying McCarthy's performances and on what it means to watch difficult, potentially nauseating performances repeatedly. By contrasting my own reading and my own feelings of watching a piece with those of Smith's as a live observer of McCarthy's performances, I'm interested in how feelings of disgust influence subjective and critical engagement with the work. McCarthy engineers moments which bring his audience to the brink or limits of their disgust, and yet doesn't offer a way out. I'm framing vomiting in this sense as a cathartic cleansing or rejection of that which is otherwise indigestible. But McCarthy doesn't give us this. He leaves his audience lingering, compelled to keep watching, or to watch repeatedly, perhaps out of genuine concern, morbid fascination, or bravado. My thinking around these performances is informed by recent scholarship about the influence of affect and emotion on critics of contemporary art and performance. This work also questions what it means for both the audience and the artist to put feelings at the centre of discussion. As Jennifer Doyle has suggested, rather than defining emotion, or in this case disgust, as something that rises up from the inside or as something that sinks in from the outside, emotions are profoundly intersubjective. They do not happen inside the individual, but in relation to others. Citing Sarah Ahmed's work, The Cultural Politics of Emotion, Doyle proposes that, quote, emotion does more than mark the boundary between the self and other. Emotion brings those boundaries into being. end quote. In this case, the feeling of disgust does more than mark the boundary between being able to cope, i.e. hold it together for one performance and not another. It is through this response that such boundaries are constructed between the audience and the artist, and between individual audience members, and in this case troubled. Here I discuss how McCarthy engineers these potentially difficult situations in performance by focusing on particular moments in Hot Dog and Tubbing. These moments, for me, mark the borders of intimacy, alienation and disgust as they come into being. In 1974, McCarthy performed Hot Dog in a basement studio in Los Angeles for an audience of invited friends. It was an intimate affair to which the artist invited only as many people as could fit at a couple of small round tables set with places of hot dogs, as if in a restaurant. The performance begins with the artist stripping to his underwear and shaving his body. He stuffs his penis into a hot dog bun, securing it in place with tape, and then smears himself with mustard. McCarthy drinks ketchup from a bottle and stuffs hot dogs into his mouth. He binds his head with gauze, adding yet more hot dogs, and tapes his bulging mouth closed so that the protruding mouth looks like a snout. Here, McCarthy appears to perform only to himself. With his eyes, nose, ears and mouth obscured by the gauze, he is oblivious to the audience's presence. He performs this opening routine without acknowledging his guests, which, as Kerry Levine has suggested, serves to assert the privacy of his performance and its locale, leaving the audience in the awkward position of having gathered to watch a character consumed by his own personal habits, end quote. Alone, but also in the company of his audience, McCarthy creates an intimate and convivial atmosphere. The performance is only for those few he has invited, fellow artists and friends, but there is also an element of potential physical risk, as well as awkwardness and isolation. One of the audience members was McCarthy's friend and fellow artist Barbara T. Smith, whose pioneering work in feminist performance and body art since the 1960s had been influential for McCarthy's work and others of his generation. In her piece entitled Ritual Meal from 1968, Smith hosted a dinner party in which guests were given surgical tools with which to consume a meal, whilst footage of open heart surgery was projected onto the walls around them. As one writer reports, quote, "The experience gave the illusion of consuming a human body. Some of the guests had very strong physical reactions and were unable to eat meat for days afterwards," end quote. This piece has particular resonance with McCarthy's interest in exploring both desire and disgust as driving forces in consumerist culture, and his influence on the intimacy and alienation felt by audiences who witness and thus consume his performances. Describing Hot Dog in an article in 1979, Smith's account is both formally descriptive and personally affective, exploring the emotional and physical forces at work. Describing the moments directly after McCarthy has stuffed his mouth with hot dogs and bound his head with gauze, Smith writes, "We, the audience, are agog with wincing dumb pain. I struggle inwardly to control the impulse to gag. He, McCarthy, stands alone, struggling with himself, trying to prevent his own retching. It is apparent that he is about to vomit. I look around desperately to see if I would ruin the performance and our sense of stamina by simply leaving. Should he vomit, he might choke to death, since the vomit would have no place to go. And should any one of us vomit, we might trigger him to do likewise. The terrible moment passes and the piece continues. I don't seem to recall how it ended, but this discomfort that we all felt is the essential audience response to McCarthy's work," end quote. Smith is both physically disgusted, she feels like she wants to vomit, and considerate, not wanting McCarthy to do the same, which, because his mouth is obstructed, would have much more dangerous consequences. It's not that vomiting during her friend's performance would seem somehow unsupportive or inappropriate, although some might take it as such. Rather, the repercussions of doing so might have triggered a second, more dangerous convulsion in the artist. It is telling that Smith describes the artist as alone and struggling with himself, trying to prevent his own retching. Although surrounded by friends and colleagues, McCarthy performs an isolated struggle to overcome the responses of his own body to the violence of being force-fed. In turn, the audience are also struggling to repress their urge to retch, but collectively display an outward expression of what Smith characterises as a sense of stamina by sitting patiently through the performance. Smith highlights the threat to the body, both the performers and the audiences, when its protective urges are not just resisted, but forcibly repressed. Whilst McCarthy is performing for an audience, he does not acknowledge it. Any social communion in the sense of empathy or collective experience is registered through an individual and subjective audience members' reading. In my reading of Tubbing, I also see the artist struggling in isolation, this time without a live audience. I observe his struggle in attempting to overcome the symbolic process of consuming oneself, as well as the physical violence of vomiting and thus rejecting this process. After a brief description of the work, I focus in on one moment in which, for me, the limits of disgust are reached and the boundaries of subjectivity troubled. In this moment, the threat of vomiting is never actually realised, the violence only ever latent. Lingering on the border between expulsion and ingestion, McCarthy's performance of consumerism evokes what Julia Kristeva has termed the most elementary and archaic form of abjection, namely food loathing. In Tubbing, McCarthy performs naked and wears a platinum blonde wig and gaudy makeup, which is applied by a female assistant. The artist performs in a bathtub half filled with water, playfully splashing and lathering himself with cold cream. Holding a sausage in one hand, McCarthy pours a bottle of ketchup over the sausage and himself. He applies more cold cream to his torso, backside and legs, still brandishing the sausage, which is now dripping with ketchup. He reaches out of the bathtub and takes a handful of minced meat, which is resting on the edge of the toilet seat, kneading and rolling it on the side of the bath. He takes a bite of the ground meat, retches and gags. He does this repeatedly and in noticeable discomfort, until finally he swallows. He drinks ketchup directly from the bottle and applies it liberally to his groin, before sucking the meat out of the sausage he's been holding all the while. He wraps a bandage around his groin, tying it around his waist and legs, and begins the arduous process of washing himself clean in the now filthy bathwater. Halfway through the performance, McCarthy draws a blue flowery curtain across the side of the bath, partially obscuring the audience's view from this presumably private ritual. He turns his back to the camera so that all that can be seen is the movement of one arm as he fondles something on the side of the bath. With a swish of his hair, he turns to reveal a fistful of raw ground meat in one hand. He's been steadily moulding and remoulding it into a ball, which he then positions in full view of the camera. Taking a smaller handful from the pile, he puts it into his mouth and chews. He retches. Emitting guttural choking sounds, he closes his eyes and lets his mouth hang wide open. Its contents clearly visible, but being neither ingested nor expelled, it remains on the border, a glistening, sticky, flesh-coloured mass. Having overcome his nausea, the artist sits back on his heels in the stagnant water, seemingly at ease. He bites off another chunk, and chewing determinedly, retches again. This time he has even more flesh to overcome. Slowly, and with eyes closed in concentration, McCarthy chews and chews, gradually diminishing the ball of meat. The camera focuses in on his mouth, which he opens and closes like a fish, as his body decides which way this will go, in or out. Indeed, it goes out, and violently shoots from his mouth and into the bath as he coughs loudly. He recovers quickly and glides playfully around the bath. Squeaking his knees against the bottom of the tub, he stuffs yet another fistful of meat into his mouth. He stands up suddenly, swishing his hair back and forth, retching and swaying. This time he swallows the remaining meat, a relief but also a concern for his subsequent actions, as he lurches around disorientated, seemingly in some discomfort, unsure of what to do next. Whilst the rest of the performance is similarly visceral, the temptation to skip over this sequence is, for me, particularly strong, not least because the artist's actions are so laboured, painfully determined, and deliberately resistant to the body's urge to vomit. Key to the significance of this moment, I think, is the tension between McCarthy's conscious and continual action of consuming raw ground hamburger meat, the raw material of an otherwise popular fast food, and his body's strenuous efforts to reject it. Kerry Levine has suggested that, quote, the common foods that McCarthy features are emblematic of broad cultural values, edible icons of Americana that are not only mass-produced, but symbolic of mass production and consumption themselves, end quote. McCarthy presents the struggle between the image of the body, the artist consuming the raw materials of American popular culture, and the body's protective urge to vomit. During this sequence, McCarthy loses and then gains control over his body's rejection of that which is force-fed. Perhaps a reflection of the bravado of the viewer, who forces themselves to watch, seemingly gaining a victory over their own feelings of nausea, induced and evoked by McCarthy's. The uncanniness of this performance stems in part from the familiarity of these everyday consumables, which are then subverted. McCarthy's ingestion of raw meat, in particular, violates the convention of civilised eating, both in the consumption of uncooked, processed meat and by mimicking the process and gestures of consumption. McCarthy chews his food not for sustenance or for pleasure, but as a gesture of resistance against his own body as he overcomes its various attempts to reject it. It looks instead like an empty gesture, as if he's complacently chewing a ball of gum rather than a fistful of meat. Mastication, a consumerist gesture, is in this case also a submissive action, one repeated often enough so as to be indiscriminate as to the acceptance of force-fed images. The ketchup and cold cream act as lubricants, not merely for the objects interacting with and penetrating the body, but for the slipperiness of the images that play out in his work. McCarthy's use of food in performances as force-fed images of American popular culture has lent itself well to readings of his work as an exploration of abjection, of that which simultaneously sustains and repels us. Describing the physical responses of food loathing, quote, perhaps the most elementary and archaic form of abjection, Julia Kristeva articulates an experience very much like that of observing one of McCarthy's performances. Quote, when the eyes see or the lips touch that skin on the surface of milk, harmless, thin as a sheet of cigarette paper, pitiful as a nail paring, I experience a gagging sensation, and still farther down, spasms in the stomach, the belly, and all the organs shrivel up, the body, provoke tears and bile, increase heartbeat, cause forehead and hands to perspire, end quote. In tubbing, it is McCarthy's lips that touch the milk skin, in this case the raw meat, ketchup, hot dog penis, but it is the audience who witness. The spasms and vomiting, as Kristeva suggests, are protective urges, my safeguards, she says, the primers of my culture. In tubbing, McCarthy resists this protective gesture and eventually overcomes it. The image of the artist struggling to overcome his body's response to this food loathing is also transferred to the viewer. In turn, the viewer is nauseated not by the experience of consuming food, but of consuming images. However, as Kristeva goes on to suggest, this food, whilst other to the self, is also part of the self-same system of nurturing and sustenance which the body needs to survive. Therefore, in rejecting or abjecting this food, we also abject ourselves. In McCarthy's performances, the images and culture he claims to reject both destroys and sustains him. A theme that runs throughout his work is the simultaneous cooptation and critique of the cultural systems, both popular culture and the art world, in which he participates. In my reading of tubbing, McCarthy enacts precisely this tension between the performing body, the eye, and the image body, the jettisoned object which is consumed and expelled through the process of acculturation. The result is a performance which draws the artist and his viewer towards the place where meaning collapses. As Ralph Rugoff has described McCarthy's work, quote, there is no single truth to this material, only an ad hoc emotional response that derives not only from the inherent qualities of condiments, but from changing contexts and, ultimately, our susceptibilities to symbolic manipulation, end quote. In both Hot Dog and Tubbing, McCarthy induces an affective response in the viewer which mimics the bodily responses of the artist, i.e. the discomfort or nausea relating to his force-feeding, retching and choking. The feeling of disgust may result from an inability to cope with a difficult or potentially emotional situation. It provides a way of turning against or turning away from the thing itself, deferring the pain, discomfort or nausea to a different form. Writers have variously described McCarthy's work as inducing fear, laughter and disgust, sometimes all at once. Critic Dan Cameron suggests that, quote, McCarthy eliminates the possibility of psychologically distancing oneself from what is taking place, and the viewer laughs and recoils at the same time, end quote. Without actually seeing these performances, it seems like quite a lot of ground to cover for him to induce both laughter and disgust at the same time. And I realised only recently, whilst writing this paper, that I've never actually watched one of McCarthy's performance recordings for an extended period of time in someone else's presence. In fact, I think it might even create a sense of awkwardness or conflict, not only within the individual, as they simultaneously feel disgusted, amused, embarrassed, etc., but also between individuals whose potentially differing responses mark them out from their peers as somehow overly reactionary or emotional. This polarisation and challenging of responses to potentially difficult art is, I think, one of the most effective critical elements of McCarthy's work. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Harriet. So we've got, time again for one or two questions if anybody has thoughts, questions.
I found the end of the paper really fascinating, just that last note, because that was exactly what I was thinking while you were giving the paper, was about actually the difference between watching even a performance with a very small audience and a videotape that's made to be watched by, well, it's unclear actually kind of who it's meant to be watched by, because it's so long that it's very unlikely that anybody's ever going to watch it at its full length in the museum setting. And I kind of just wondered if you could talk a little bit more about that difference and kind of why he shifted towards these kind of video pieces, and whether there's something kind of distinctive about them, because obviously it loses lots of the things that people talk about in relation to them, stuff like the smell and you know, some of the sort of sound effects and obviously the kind of direct relationality of the person to the performer that seems very important to the kind of argument that you're making. So I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about that shift.
Yeah, great, thank you. So in the longer version of this paper, I make that point, and lots of other writers make that point as well, about the live performance of McCarthy's work in particular, because he uses a sort of vocabulary of condiments that he sort of run throughout his work. One of the things that you miss out on in video and documentation is the smell of ketchup. And I think Amelia Jones writes something about ketchup reminding her of kind of family barbecues, but at the same time McCarthy sort of subverts it and makes it perversely sexual. So it's kind of puts his audience in an awkward situation of having sort of gathered to watch something which in fact unfolds to be something completely different. And the other thing about, so shifting from making live performance to video works, I think this has got something to do, I think, with McCarthy's sense of awkwardness himself. He didn't actually do that many live performances. He did a handful, and noted for some of them they were just particularly awkward. Audience members left, or particularly if they were performances for the public, for people he didn't really know. He did a piece called Class Fall in 1976 in a classroom, in a maths classroom, and it was similarly kind of visceral, and he kind of interacted with the audience members and kind of moved out between them, and everyone sort of got so frightened they left. And actually McCarthy, recounting his kind of thoughts about that, it seems like it really kind of affected him as well, emotionally and kind of psychologically. I think he moved away from making live works to making video, kind of for that reason. It's a bit of a sort of squishy, emotional thing to say, but what's the other thing I was going to say? Oh yes, and in 1983 he declared that he was retiring from performance altogether. He continued to make video works into the 90s, but I think, an accumulation of sort of emotional wearing down of being the one of putting oneself out there. I think that sounds a bit emotional and kind of squishy response, but something is lost, I think. But I think that's because he perhaps felt that as well. So that kind of the intimacy and alienation of the audience that I was talking about, I think probably he felt that as an artist as well. I don't know. Well, I can't say what he felt. Thanks.
Isn't the sort of
citing within a video format, isn't that also largely related to McCarthy? Like you talked about this critique of the consumer culture, and isn't it because of obviously the television culture being very integral to that? Is that key to that move to that media as well?
I think so. Yeah, I think I think that framing, so the literal framing of putting a video camera around what people were seeing, i.e. controlling what people are seeing. Kind of directing that control onto his viewers and his consumers. And certainly I think that also related to his concern or his interest with consumerist culture as mediated through a television set. So the way people get information is through a television set. The way people get information about the Vietnam War is through the television set. And I think he was interested in that sense of controlling violence and controlling viscera by putting a frame around it. And that, in a way, allowed him to have much more control than in a live performance. I think he sort of trained as a visual artist, as a painter, and started making live performance. And it seems like he kind of came back to the idea of stepping away from putting himself, his subjectivity, right at the centre of the discussion, right at the centre of kind of things. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you. That was a really fascinating paper. But I would like to try to tease out, because you mentioned the magic U word, uncanny, that hasn't been mentioned around up until now. Yeah. And I was wondering if you could tease out a little bit of what you call the uncanniness of this piece. And then perhaps if you could, I don't know, what do you think the relationship between the uncanny and disgust is? Because it seems like it's in the air.
Yeah. I put that word in. I thought I'll put it in. I won't take it out because... I think for me, as someone studying these works, I think, and a lot of the literature around it is about the idea of the ketchup, mustard, mayonnaise, hot dogs, hamburger meat as being kind of familiar items you might see in everyday culture. And for me, that's not. I'm sort of learning that uncanniness from the culture that he's kind of presenting. Uncanniness. I think going back to the idea of the ketchup and the smell, so the idea of kind of enticing you into something that you find familiar or kind of comforting or nostalgic about, and then kind of subverting it. I don't know. What did you find about the uncanniness?
This was part of my question.
Yeah.
Because this was part of basically of my question, because there's a lot of the uncanny that's very much almost self-referential, and you're talking about the subjectivity of the artist, for example, being in place and actually being basically the index of all of these transformations, right? So I really was just fascinated, because I think I see what you mean by the uncanny being present, but I can't either put my finger on it, really. Yeah. But that's what I was just asking.
Yeah, I think, and another thing is about this. Somebody's written about the spaces in which tubbing takes place is within the sort of family, the intimate family private ritual of the bathroom and what you do in the bathroom. And there's a sort of partner performance to this one called Sailor's Meet, which takes place in the bedroom, which is in the building that this takes place. They're next to each other. So in terms of writing about these performances as being sort of private rituals that take place in a sort of familiar, homely setting. I don't know. There's more to say about that, certainly, but I haven't really explored it enough here. But perhaps I should. Yeah, no, it's interesting. Thank you.
Well, maybe that's a thought to keep in the back of our minds and explore over the course of the rest of the day, and indeed also tomorrow. But for the moment, I think we'll move on. Thank you so much, Harriet.
That's okay. Thank you.